It was the summer of 1978 in a small mountain town tucked between tall pine trees and misty hills. The people there lived simple lives, knowing each other by name and story. They trusted one another, left their doors unlocked, and gathered at the diner every Sunday after church. Among them was a woman named Maggie Holloway, kind, quiet, and always a little mysterious. Maggie was 32 years old, a schoolteacher who loved books and long walks through the forest trails. She lived alone in a small wooden cottage on the edge of town, where the mountains met the river. Her days were peaceful, spent teaching children, tending her garden, and writing in her old leather journal. To everyone, Maggie seemed happy, content in her quiet corner of the world. But a few people noticed that lately she seemed distant. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Sometimes she would stop mid-sentence, lost in thought, as if her mind was somewhere far away. On the evening of June 14th, a storm rolled over the town. Thick gray clouds covered the sky and thunder echoed across the hills. Most people hurried home before the rain hit, but from her cottage window, Maggie stood still, watching the dark sky. Her neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, saw her silhouette through the curtains. Maggie looked like she was waiting for something, or someone. Around 8 p.m., the phone in Maggie's cottage rang. Back then, the ringing of a landline carried a kind of weight. Every call could bring news, good or bad. Ruth, who lived next door, said she saw the light turn on in Maggie's front room, then a shadow moving back and forth. The rain started to fall hard and the wind howled through the trees. Not long after that call, Maggie was seen leaving her house. A truck driver passing through town spotted her car, a light blue sedan, heading toward the old logging road that led deep into the mountains. It wasn't a safe route, especially in bad weather. The road was narrow, muddy, and often washed out during storms. Still, that's the direction she took, her headlights cutting through the rain. The next morning, when Maggie didn't show up for work, her students waited for her. They thought she might be sick, but when the principal tried to call her home, no one answered. By noon, Ruth went to check on her. Maggie's car was gone. The lights were off. The cottage was silent. On the kitchen table sat a half-drunk cup of tea and an open book, a collection of poetry she often read when she couldn't sleep. That afternoon, the local sheriff's office received a call reporting a missing person. A search began immediately, though the rain had made the mountain roads nearly impossible to drive. Volunteers, police officers, and even a few hunters joined in. They combed through the woods, shouting her name, flashing their lights into the thick brush. The river had swollen from the storm, rushing violently through the valley. Some feared she had tried to cross and been swept away. For 3 days, the search continued. They found her car a few miles from the main road, half buried in mud near a broken guardrail. The driver's door was open. Inside, the seats were soaked from the rain and the keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, and then just the sound of the river below. It was as if she had stepped out of the car and disappeared into thin air. The sheriff at the time, a man named Tom Garrison, spoke to the press briefly. He said there was no evidence of foul play, though he admitted the situation was unusual. He suggested that Maggie might have lost control of her car during the storm, tried to find help, and gotten lost in the woods. Her family didn't believe it. Her younger brother, David, came from the next town over and searched day and night. He refused to give up even when the official search ended. As weeks passed, theories began to spread. Some said Maggie had been planning to leave town for a long time. Others whispered about a man she'd been seen with, someone new, not from around there. No one knew his name, only that he drove a dark car and met her near the diner late in the evenings. A few people said they'd seen the two arguing outside once, but no one wanted to get involved. In a small town, gossip travels faster than truth. Her disappearance became the kind of story that people told in quiet voices, one of those remember when tales that faded but never truly vanished. Every few years, when the rain came heavy or another car went off the mountain road, someone would bring up Maggie Holloway. She just vanished, they'd say. No body, no note, nothing. Ruth, her neighbor, never believed she left willingly. She remembered the way Maggie had looked that last evening, standing at the window, phone in hand, watching the storm roll in. Ruth often said she looked like she knew something bad was coming. Life moved on in the town, as it always does. The cottage eventually fell into disrepair, The school hired a new teacher. Children grew up, new families moved in, and Maggie's story slipped into local legend. But for those who had known her, the students she taught, the friends she laughed with, the questions never left. What happened that night? Who had called her? And why would she drive toward the mountains during a storm? David kept her memory alive. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, he would drive up to the old logging road, place a single white rose near the spot where her car was found, and whisper, "I'm still looking, Maggie." He grew older, but his hope never faded. In the years that followed, the mountain itself changed. Landslides reshaped the slopes, storms washed away trails, and trees grew where the road once was. The area became overgrown, almost as if the forest wanted to hide what had happened. Nature, it seemed, had swallowed her secret whole. Yet there were odd things people noticed over time. Hikers claimed to find old pieces of metal or cloth deep in the woods, but nothing that could be tied directly to her. A local hunter once found a torn photograph near the riverbank, blurred and water-stained, showing what looked like a woman's face. It was thrown away before anyone could confirm who it was. The mystery of Maggie Holloway became part of the town's identity. It was mentioned in local papers from time to time, especially when anniversaries came around or when someone new took interest in the old case files. There was never enough evidence to say what really happened. Some believed she ran away, some believed she was taken, but no one could ever prove either. And then, as years turned into decades, her story faded almost completely from public memory. By the time 2022 came around, few people in town even knew her name. The road where she vanished was long closed, swallowed by weeds and soil. Most thought the case would remain a mystery forever, a cold shadow of the past that would never be disturbed again. But mountains, like people, hold secrets only for so long. And when nature decides to speak, it doesn't whisper, it roars. Because on one stormy morning, more than 40 years later, a landslide would rip through that same forgotten hillside, uncovering something that would bring Maggie Holloway's name back to every tongue in town. Her story wasn't over. It was only buried, waiting for the right moment to be found. It had been more than 40 years since Maggie Holloway disappeared. The old logging road where her car was found was now covered in grass and wildflowers. The people who once searched for her were mostly gone, and the few who remembered spoke of her only when the rain came heavy. It felt like the mountain had swallowed her story forever, but the mountain wasn't done yet. In the early months of 2022, the town faced the worst rain it had seen in decades. Storm after storm rolled over the hills, washing away soil, flooding basements, and turning creeks into raging rivers. People stayed indoors, listening to the pounding rain against their roofs and praying the hills would hold. But one night in late March, the earth finally gave way. On the north side of the mountain, a massive landslide tore through the hillside. Trees toppled, mud poured down like a wave, and a stretch of the old logging road, the same one Maggie had driven on all those years ago, collapsed into the valley. For a moment, the sound was like thunder that wouldn't stop. Then came silence. When the storm cleared the next morning, people came to see the damage. Roads were broken, power lines were down, and mud covered everything. But near the bottom of the slide, where the earth had shifted the deepest, something strange caught their eye. Sticking out from the brown mud was a piece of metal, small, curved, and shining faintly in the morning light. At first, they thought it was just junk from an old construction site. But when rescue workers arrived to clear the road, they realized it was something much older. A car. A car that looked like it had been buried for a very long time. It took a few days before they could pull it out completely. The mud was thick and heavy, and the slope was unstable. When they finally managed to free the car, the crowd that had gathered gasped. It was a faded blue sedan, the same model that had been listed in old records, the car that belonged to Maggie Holloway. News spread fast through town. Reporters showed up and camera crews filmed the scene. People who had never even heard of Maggie's name before started asking questions. For the older folks, it was like a ghost from the past had come back to life. "That's her car," someone whispered. After all these years, the police were called in and the area was closed off. Forensic teams carefully opened the car door, and inside they found what everyone feared but somehow expected. A set of human remains sitting in the driver's seat, almost completely turned to dust, and time had done its work quietly, hidden beneath layers of soil and roots, but that wasn't all they found. In the back seat was a leather handbag, covered in dirt but still intact. And inside that bag was something remarkable, an envelope sealed and yellowed with age. On the front in faded handwriting were the words, "If something happens to me." The town fell silent after that discovery. It felt unreal, like a story that had been waiting to finish itself. The remains were carefully taken for examination, and the envelope was sent to the police lab for preservation. Everyone wanted to know what it said, what secret Maggie might have tried to leave behind. For days, the small-town diner buzzed with talk. People who weren't even born when she vanished had their theories. Some said she had been murdered and hidden there. Others thought she might have been running away from someone dangerous. A few even said the car had been pushed there intentionally, hidden under the earth before the landslide buried it completely. Nobody knew, but everyone wanted answers. The local sheriff's department handed the case over to the county's cold case unit. That's when Detective Elena Ruiz arrived. Quiet, focused, and known for solving old mysteries that others had given up on. She had spent years reopening unsolved disappearances, and when she heard about the car on the mountain, she drove in the next morning. The sight was haunting. The vehicle sat near the base of the hill, surrounded by mud, its windows cracked and half covered in moss. The air still smelled of wet soil and pine. For Elena, it felt like stepping back in time. She looked at the car and imagined that stormy night in 1978, the headlights slicing through the rain, the sound of the engine echoing off the hills, and then, silence. When the lab results came back a week later, they confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Maggie Holloway. DNA matched with her niece, one of the few living relatives left. After 44 years, the town finally had an answer, at least part of one. Elena was there when they opened the envelope. It was fragile, the paper almost falling apart. Inside was a single folded letter and 2 old photographs. The letter was short, written in Maggie's familiar looping handwriting. The words were shaky, as if written in fear. It read, "If anything happens to me, look for the truth near the airfield. He won't stop until I'm gone." That was it. No signature, no details, just those few chilling lines. The 2 photographs were just as strange. One showed Maggie standing beside a small plane, smiling, the sun bright behind her. The other was of her with a man no one recognized, standing outside what looked like an airstrip. Both photos were dated only days before she vanished. Elena studied the photos carefully. The man beside Maggie looked older, dressed sharply, confident. There was something about him, the way he stood slightly apart, his arm not quite touching her shoulder, that told Elena their connection wasn't simple. When she showed the photos around town, a few people thought they recognized the airfield. There used to be a private one a few miles south, long abandoned, now hidden among the trees. But no one remembered who owned it. Digging through old files, Elena discovered that in 1978, that airfield was connected to a local businessman named Raymond Cole. He had once been a respected figure in town, wealthy, charming, and known for throwing fancy gatherings. But around the same time Maggie disappeared, he left town suddenly, selling his property and moving away. His name had never come up in the original investigation. The more Elena read, the stranger it became. There were mentions of illegal shipments, rumors of cash moving across borders, and whispers about a few powerful men who had managed to keep their names out of the papers. It was clear that Maggie had known something she wasn't supposed to. Still, for the town, it was simply emotional. People left flowers by the landslide site. They lit candles and said prayers for her. After decades of wondering, they finally had proof she hadn't just run away. But for Elena, it wasn't closure. It was a beginning. She visited the mountain again one evening, standing where the car had been pulled from the mud. The air was cool, quiet, and filled with the scent of rain-soaked pine. She thought about the letter. "He won't stop until I'm gone." Whoever he was, Maggie had tried to leave a message for someone to find. It had taken more than 4 decades, but nature had finally brought that message to light. The case was reopened officially. Files that had been collecting dust for years were pulled from storage. Old witnesses were tracked down. And deep down, Elena knew this wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about giving a woman her voice back after years of silence. As night fell on the mountain, the wind moved gently through the trees, almost like a whisper, somewhere between the shadows and the sound of the forest. It felt like Maggie's presence lingered, waiting, patient as if she knew that finally, someone was listening. The truth had been buried for too long, and now after so many years the mountain had spoken. The past was no longer hidden. Detective Elena Ruiz spent her days surrounded by case files, dusty photos, and fading memories. The reopened Holloway case had taken over her mind completely. Every time she looked at the letter Maggie had written, "If something happens to me, look for the truth near the airfield." She felt the weight of an unfinished story pressing on her. She started by driving out to where the old private airfield used to be. The road leading there was cracked and overgrown. Nature had claimed most of it, turning the once busy strip into a place of silence. The hangar, once painted white, now stood in rust and rot. The roof had collapsed in places, and birds had made nests inside. But as Elena walked through the dirt and debris, she could almost imagine Maggie here, standing in the sun holding that letter, looking over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. She took her time searching the site. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. An old metal sign with the name Cole Air Transport, barely visible beneath layers of dust. That name, Raymond Cole, kept appearing in her research. In the late 70s, he had owned several small transport businesses and had connections stretching from California to Mexico. He left town suddenly right after Maggie disappeared. It didn't feel like coincidence. Back at her office, Elena pinned the two photographs on the wall. One of Maggie smiling beside a small plane, and one with Cole standing next to her, expressionless. She stared at them for a long time. There was something off in the man's eyes, not warmth, not affection, but control. Possession, maybe. She wondered what kind of relationship they really had. She went digging through old county records and found something odd. Cole's company had been under quiet investigation for illegal transport activity in 1978. The files mentioned smuggling, large sums of cash, and missing evidence. And in one handwritten note from a federal agent there was a single line, "Potential witness M. Holloway." Elena leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. Maggie had been a witness. A schoolteacher caught up in something dangerous. Maybe she'd seen something she shouldn't have. Maybe she had tried to tell someone and paid the price for it. The next day, Elena drove 2 towns over to speak with the only living person who had known Cole personally, a retired mechanic named Frank who used to service his planes. Frank lived in a small trailer by the coast. His hands still carried the stains of engine oil and his eyes looked tired but sharp. When Elena showed him the photograph of Cole and Maggie, he didn't hesitate. That's him, all right. Cole always had a woman around. But that one, she was different. She didn't look like the others. She looked scared. Frank told her that in the summer of 1978, Maggie had visited the hangar more than once. Sometimes she'd come alone and wait in her car. Other times she'd go inside with Cole and leave looking shaken. He remembered hearing them arguing one evening, her voice trembling, his sharp and angry. Then a week later, both of them were gone. Elena asked if anyone else had been there. Frank nodded slowly. There was a man. Didn't get his name. Wore a suit, fancy shoes, government type maybe. He came by asking about Cole a few days before she disappeared. I told him I didn't know much. But he wasn't asking, he was warning. Ted, tell your boss to keep quiet or things will get messy. After that, Cole packed up everything and left. Driving back through the rain, Elena couldn't shake the image of Maggie standing alone at that airfield, caught between fear and hope. Maybe she had planned to turn Cole in. Maybe she had written that letter knowing exactly what might happen if she tried. Back at the station, Elena went through the police reports from 1978 again. The original investigation had never mentioned Cole's name, not once. It was as if he'd been erased. Even the sheriff's notes were vague, focusing only on Maggie's car in the storm. Something wasn't right. Either the records had been altered or someone back then had wanted the case to stay cold. Elena visited the local paper archives, hoping for more leads. There she met an old journalist named Walter, who had covered the story when it first broke. He was retired but still came by the office to help organize old clippings. When she mentioned Maggie's name, he gave a sad smile. I remember her, he said. Sweet woman. Everyone loved her. But there was a lot more to that story than whatever got printed. He pulled out a box filled with yellowed papers and brittle photos. We got a call back then, anonymous, and telling us to stop. Digging into Maggie's case. The editor told me to drop it. Said it was above our pay grade. He laughed softly. I thought it was just small-town gossip, but now I'm not so sure. Among the old photos was one that made Elena's heart stop. It was of the sheriff from that time, Tom Garrison, shaking hands with Raymond Cole at a ribbon-cutting event for the airfield, just weeks before Maggie disappeared. The man who had claimed there was no foul play was clearly close to the main suspect. When Elena returned to her car, she sat in silence for a long time. She knew what this meant. Someone inside the system had helped cover up the truth. Maybe Garrison had been paid to close the case quietly. Maybe he'd destroyed evidence. Either way, Maggie had been alone in her fight. That night, she reopened her laptop and started typing out her notes. The timeline was coming together. Maggie meets Cole sometime in early 1978. She learns about his illegal shipments. She decides to go to the authorities. Cole finds out. She disappears. And now, decades later, the mountain had given up the evidence that someone once worked very hard to bury. But one question still burned in Elena's mind. Who was the man in the second photograph? The one standing behind Cole near the plane? His face was familiar somehow, like she'd seen him in an old file. She scanned through the records again and froze when she found a photo of a federal agent named Richard Hale, who had worked on smuggling cases during that same time. The resemblance was striking. If Hale and Cole had been working together, that would explain everything. The silence, the vanishing files, the lack of follow-up. Maggie might have tried to blow the whistle, but no one had listened. And those who should have protected her had instead looked away. Elena stared at the photos, at the smiling woman who had trusted the wrong people, and felt a deep anger rise inside her. She made a promise then. She would not let Maggie's voice fade again. The mountain might have buried her story, but now that it was out, it deserved to be heard. The next morning, Elena drove to a nursing home in Arizona where public records showed Raymond Cole was living under a new name. The air was dry and heavy with heat, a stark contrast to the misty mountains of home. She sat across from him in a small visiting room, his eyes dull with age but still sharp with recognition when he heard her name. "Detective Ruiz," he said quietly. "I was wondering when someone would come asking about her." He smiled faintly, and in that moment Elena knew. He wasn't surprised. He'd been waiting. "What happened to Maggie Holloway?" she asked. Cole leaned back, his voice low and measured. She was smart. Too smart for her own good. She thought she could run, but running doesn't always mean escape. Elena's stomach turned. "Did you hurt her?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Detective. I didn't have to. She was already running from something much bigger than me." When she left the room, the sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky gold. The truth was closer now, but it wasn't finished. Maggie's story was more than just one man's crime. It was a web that reached far beyond what anyone in that small town ever imagined. And Elena knew one thing for certain: the mountain had only told part of the story. The rest was still waiting to be uncovered. Detective Elena Ruiz couldn't stop thinking about her meeting with Raymond Cole. His calmness unsettled her. The way he spoke about Maggie Holloway, as if she were just another problem to be handled, left a chill that wouldn't fade. He hadn't admitted to anything, but he hadn't denied much either. His words lingered in her mind. "She was already running from something much bigger than me." Back in her office, Elena stared at the board covered with photos, maps, and notes. She had built a timeline of Maggie's final days, but there were still too many blanks. She needed to know what had made Maggie so afraid, and who she was really running from. The letter hinted at danger, but not from Cole alone. There had to be someone else. Someone powerful enough to make the whole case vanish back in 1978. Elena went digging through federal archives, this time searching not for Maggie, but for the men who might have been involved with Cole. It took weeks of requests, calls, and late-night reading before she found what she was looking for. Old case files marked confidential from a smuggling investigation that had quietly ended in 1979. The lead agent in charge? Richard Hale, the same man in Maggie's photograph, standing behind Cole near the airfield. The file detailed a string of illegal shipments, not drugs or weapons, but rare artifacts and cash being moved across the border. Hale had been investigating Cole's company, at least officially, but the deeper Elena read, the clearer it became that the two men had been working together. They were partners, not enemies. The investigation had been nothing more than a cover-up. Maggie must have discovered their secret. Maybe she overheard something or found documents she wasn't supposed to see. She had gone to the authorities thinking she was doing the right thing, but the very people she turned to were the ones she needed protection from. Elena leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Maggie had no chance back then. She had been trapped between two powerful men, one who loved control and another who hid behind a badge. And when she tried to escape, they erased her. Still, there were missing pieces. Elena needed proof, something physical that could link Cole and Hale to the smuggling ring. The letter mentioned the airfield, but maybe Maggie had hidden something there before she died. Something that could tell the rest of her story. The next morning, Elena drove back up the old road leading to the abandoned airstrip. The air was cool and heavy with fog. She parked near the rusted hangar and walked slowly, scanning the ground for anything that seemed out of place. Birds circled overhead, and the forest was silent except for the sound of her footsteps. She noticed a patch of ground near the edge of the airfield where the soil looked disturbed, newer, less compact. Kneeling down, she brushed away leaves and dirt until her fingers hit something hard, a metal box, small and rusted shut. Her pulse quickened. It was old, heavy, and covered in mud. She wrapped it in her jacket and took it straight to the station. When the evidence team pried it open, the smell of earth and age filled the room. Inside were papers, faded but still readable. There were old receipts, photographs, and a small black notebook. The first page was written in Maggie's handwriting. The words were simple but powerful. "If they find me, this will prove everything." Elena read through the pages carefully. Maggie had documented everything. Dates, names, meeting times, even numbers from bank transfers. She had known exactly what was happening. Cole's airfield had been used to move stolen artifacts across the border, and Agent Hale had helped cover it up. Maggie had written that she planned to hand the notebook over to a contact in the Justice Department, but she never got the chance. Elena's hands trembled as she turned the last page. There was a list of initials, RC, RH, and one more she didn't recognize, TG. For a moment she couldn't place it. Then it hit her. TG, Tom Garrison, the sheriff who had handled Maggie's disappearance. The same man who had shaken hands with Cole in that old photograph, so that was it. The local sheriff, the federal agent, and the businessman meant all working together. They had silenced Maggie to protect themselves, and for more than 40 years their secret had stayed buried. Until now, Elena's next step was clear. She needed to confirm Hale's involvement. He had retired decades ago, but a few calls led her to his last known address, a quiet neighborhood outside of Phoenix. When she arrived, she found an old man sitting on a porch, a newspaper in his hands. He looked up, eyes narrowing when he saw her badge. "Detective Ruiz," he said before she even introduced herself. "You're not here about me, are you?" "I'm here about Maggie Holloway," Elena replied. For a moment his face stayed still, unreadable. Then he sighed. That name again. She told him what she had found. The letter, the notebook, the box buried at the airfield. His expression didn't change, but his hands gripped the newspaper tightly. "You shouldn't have dug that up," he said quietly. "Some stories are meant to stay buried." Elena didn't look away. "You let an innocent woman die." Hale's voice hardened. "You don't understand. Back then things were different. People made deals to keep the country clean. Sometimes the truth does more damage than the lie." Elena felt anger rise in her chest. "She trusted you." He met her eyes and said nothing. Then in a low voice, almost to himself, he added, "She was going to leave town. I warned her not to. She didn't listen." It was the closest thing to a confession she was going to get. When Elena left his house, she knew he would never face trial. He was too old, too protected. But she also knew she had enough evidence to reopen the investigation publicly. Maggie's notebook was the key. Back in town, the story spread quickly. Reporters arrived again, just like they had during the landslide. Only this time they weren't talking about a missing woman. They were talking about a cover-up. The local news aired the story, showing Maggie's photo, her handwriting, and the discovery of the lockbox. The community that had once whispered about her disappearance now spoke her name with respect. Elena watched it all quietly. For her, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about justice, long delayed but finally possible. She thought of Maggie writing that note, knowing she might never be heard. Now, after decades of silence, her voice was echoing. across the town that had forgotten her. Later that week, Elena drove up to the mountain again. The landslide area had been cleared, and the earth looked peaceful now, as if it had released what it needed to. She stood by the spot where Maggie's car had been found and placed a small white flower in the soil. "You didn't run for nothing," she whispered. "They can't hide anymore." The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a moment the forest seemed to breathe. Elena closed her eyes and listened, not for words, but for the quiet peace that comes when a truth finally finds its way into the light. She didn't know what would happen next. Maybe the case would lead to formal charges, maybe not. Some of the men involved were long gone. But she knew one thing. The world would finally know who Maggie Holloway was, not just a missing woman, but someone who stood up for what was right, even when it cost her everything. Driving down the mountain road that evening, the sun broke through the clouds. The light touched the trees, warm and golden, and for the first time since reopening the case, Elena felt something she hadn't in years. Closure. The mountain had kept its secret long enough. Now it was Maggie's turn to be free. The morning sun rose slowly over the mountains, painting the mist in soft gold. The forest was quiet again, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. But the town below was alive with whispers, questions, and long-forgotten memories. The truth about Maggie Holloway had finally surfaced, and it was changing everything. Detective Elena Ruiz had spent weeks preparing her report. Maggie's notebook, the photographs, the buried lockbox, everything was now part of an official record. The case that had been cold for 44 years was finally open again, this time under the watch of people who wanted the truth, not to bury it. But the more she worked, the more she realized the story was far from over. There were still unanswered questions, and not all of them could be solved by paperwork. Raymond Cole had died quietly in his sleep just 2 weeks after Elena's visit. Some said it was old age. Others thought it was guilt catching up with him. Whatever the reason, he took his side of the story to the grave. As for Richard Hale, the retired agent, he refused to speak further. When reporters tried to contact him, he simply said, "The past should stay in the past." But the past was no longer his to control. In the town, people began leaving flowers and notes near the landslide site where Maggie's car had been found. Some wrote letters, others brought candles. For the first time, her name was being spoken with love instead of mystery. Teachers told her story in classrooms, not as gossip, but as a lesson about courage and truth. Her old students, now grown with families of their own, shared stories of how kind she had been, how she always believed that even small voices could matter. Elena visited the site often. She felt a quiet connection to Maggie, two women separated by decades but bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for the truth. She would stand near the slope, watching the light change over the valley, thinking about all the years Maggie's car had been buried under that same earth. Nature had hidden her, but it had also preserved her story until someone was ready to listen. One afternoon, Elena received a call from the county archives. During restoration work, they had found an old box of sheriff's office materials from 1978. Inside were faded photos, letters, and several recordings on tape. One of them was labeled Interview, June 10, 1978. The date sent a chill through her. That was just 4 days before Maggie disappeared. When the tape was restored and played, the room filled with the faint crackle of static. Then came a woman's voice, calm, careful, and nervous. It was Maggie. "I don't want to cause trouble," the voice said softly, "but I can't stay quiet anymore." "He's not who people think he is." Elena froze. The tape went on. Maggie described seeing money being loaded onto planes, men arguing in the hangar, and a sheriff meeting with them late at night. Her voice trembled as she said, "If something happens to me, promise you'll tell the truth." And then the tape cut off. The old interview had never been logged in the official case file. Someone had hidden it just like everything else, but now, after all these years, it had resurfaced, proof that Maggie had tried to speak out before she vanished. Elena felt a wave of sadness. Maggie had done everything right, but the people meant to protect her had failed. The tape changed everything. The news spread fast again, and national reporters picked up the story. The case of Maggie Holloway became a headline. Teacher silenced in 1978. Truth finally found after landslide. It was strange seeing her name everywhere, but in a way it was justice. The world was finally hearing her. A small ceremony was held in town a few weeks later. The mayor dedicated a memorial bench near the edge of the forest, engraved with Maggie's name and a simple message: she told the truth. People gathered quietly, her family, her former students, townsfolk who remembered her laughter, and those who had only learned of her through the news. Elena stood among them, feeling both the weight of the past and the lightness of closure. As the ceremony ended, Maggie's niece, an older woman now, approached Elena. Her eyes were wet but kind. "You gave her voice back," she said. Elena smiled gently. She never lost it. The world just stopped listening for a while. Over the following months, the investigation widened. More documents surfaced, and historians started piecing together the web of corruption that had operated through small towns like theirs in the 1970s. It turned out that Maggie's discovery was only a small part of a much larger story, one involving smuggling, money laundering, and quiet cover-ups that reached far beyond one mountain town. The revelation shocked people who had lived their whole lives believing in the honesty of local leaders. But amidst all the noise, Elena kept her focus on Maggie. She went through every page of the notebook again and again, learning not just about the crime but about the woman herself. Maggie had written about her students, her hopes, her dreams of one day leaving the town for the coast. In between her notes about the smuggling ring, there were sketches of flowers, poems, and small prayers. It reminded Elena that this wasn't just a mystery, it was a life. One day, while reviewing the notebook again, she found something she hadn't noticed before. Tucked between 2 pages was a tiny photograph, a picture of Maggie standing in front of her cottage, smiling, holding a small journal in her hands. On the back, in faded ink, was a single line: "Truth has a way of finding its way home." Elena held the photo for a long time. She realized that Maggie must have known she was in danger, but she had still chosen to leave behind something for others to find. That quiet bravery moved her deeply. It wasn't about revenge or attention. It was about doing what was right no matter the cost. Months passed and life in the town began to settle again. The story that once haunted people had finally come full circle. The mountain road was repaired, and a small wooden sign was placed nearby: Holloway Ridge. Tourists often stopped there now, drawn by the story of the woman who vanished and the landslide that revealed her truth. Locals said it reminded them that no secret could stay buried forever. One late afternoon, Elena returned to the ridge one last time. The air was warm, the trees glowing with sunset light. She stood where Maggie's car had been found, the earth firm now, covered with new grass. She placed her hand on the soil and whispered, "You're home now." She stayed there for a while, listening to the sound of the wind. It moved through the trees softly like a whisper of thanks. She smiled, imagining Maggie somewhere beyond the hills, at peace after all these years. As Elena walked back to her car, she thought about everything the case had taught her, about truth, silence, and the courage it takes to speak when others turn away. The world had changed since 1978, but people still needed reminders like Maggie's story to show that even when justice comes late, it still matters. Before driving off, Elena looked back at the mountain one last time. The clouds were clearing and the light hit the ridge just right, making it glow. It felt like the mountain itself was breathing again, lighter somehow, freed from the secret it had held for so long. That night, back at home, Elena placed Maggie's photograph on her desk. She turned off the light and sat in the quiet, thinking about the line on the back of the picture. Truth has a way of finding its way home. She knew it was true. No matter how long it takes, no matter how deep it's buried, truth always finds its way back, and in that small town, surrounded by misty hills and whispering pines, the story of Maggie Holloway would be told again and again, not as a tragedy, but as a story of courage, justice, and the power of a woman who refused to be forgotten.